The October air hung thick over the trees that framed Briarcliff Hills Sanatorium like sentinels of silence standing tall, yet indifferent to the lives passing through their shadowed reach. Nestled deep in rural Tennessee, the facility appeared more like a relic than a hospital. Its limestone walls stained by decades of rain, and time its windows perpetually dim even when the sun was out. Staff described it as both peaceful and eerie, a contradiction that echoed in its long, echoing hallways and its tendency to hum with a quiet that felt deliberate. On the night of October 3, 1989, nothing in the air suggested what was to come. Patients were accounted for. Rounds were routine, and the night shift passed through the main doors, just as they always did. Yet, by the time the sun rose the next morning, 3 nurses were missing. Not late, not absent without notice, gone. Their belongings remained in place, their personal items untouched, their last known location, the East Wing isolation corridor. No one could explain it, and soon even those who tried would begin to fall silent. Helen Brooks was the most senior of the trio, a woman of 60 who had worked at Briarcliff for over 2 decades without a single recorded infraction or medical error. Known for her neatly pinned gray hair, steady voice, and the unmistakable scent of eucalyptus that followed her, Helen was the kind of nurse who inspired calm not through warmth but through control. Patients respected her. Staff trusted her. She arrived that night at 6:25 p.m., the same time she always did, thermos in hand, and her small black notebook tucked under her arm, the one she never left in her locker. Following her was Dana Morales, age 38, who had transferred from a hospital in Illinois. Under circumstances that remained vague, her file marked with commendations, but lacking details. Dana was the sort of person who made few friends, but rarely made mistakes. She spoke softly, moved quickly, and seemed always aware of who was watching her. The third nurse, Ivy Chan, was a newcomer, just 24, and full of enthusiasm that had not yet been worn down by institutional monotony. Ivy was bright, curious, and beloved by both patients and colleagues, her laugh light and frequent, her handwriting always in purple ink. They were last seen together heading toward the East Wing isolation rooms just after 9:30 p.m., each one scanning her badge at the locked double doors before disappearing beyond them. The East Wing was the quietest part of the facility designed for high-risk cases, though on that particular night only 5 patients were housed there, none considered especially volatile. What made the wing distinctive was not just its purpose but its structure. Reinforced doors, soundproofed walls, and a lack of windows that made it feel entirely separate from the rest of the hospital. According to shift logs, everything appeared normal. Medications had been distributed, vitals checked, and the wing remained sealed from the inside. After 10:15 p.m., however, there were no further entries logged into the system. None of the nurses reappeared on camera. No calls were made from the internal phone lines. No badge scans occurred to indicate anyone had exited. It was as if the entire wing had simply stopped existing after that moment, a portion of the building swallowed whole by silence. The morning staff arrived at 6 a.m., greeted not by chaos or alarm, but by an empty nurse station and an unusually calm atmosphere. It was not uncommon for night staff to be delayed during transition, especially when working with patients in the isolation unit, so no panic emerged at first. However, by 7, with no sign of Helen, Dana, or Ivy, the charge nurse on duty initiated a protocol check. She attempted calls to their pagers, which returned no signal. She checked the staff lounge and locker room and found all 3 nurses' personal belongings exactly where they had been the evening before. Helen's purse sat beneath her assigned locker, neatly zipped with her keys inside. Dana's coat hung on its hooker identification badge, still attached. Ivy's water bottle remained half full on the break room table beside a crossword puzzle she had been completing during dinner. Everything was still. Too still. By 7:35 a.m., the head of security was notified and a full sweep of the East Wing began. No forced entry was found. No patients were missing. All doors had remained locked from the inside throughout the night. Footage from the main hall cameras confirmed their entry into the wing but offered no visual of their exit. A single camera within the isolation corridor normally operational displayed a static freeze from 10:15 p.m. onward. Technicians would later confirm the feed had not malfunctioned. It had been manually disconnected. That discovery changed the tone of the entire investigation. This was no longer a missing persons case with vague boundaries. It was a sealed space with missing people, no exit route, and no sign of struggle. Detective Emery Klein was assigned to the case that very afternoon, arriving with the quiet focus of someone who understood how stories begin and how they fall apart. He was 42, calm under pressure with a reputation for listening more than he spoke and for never forgetting a detail once it was told to him. Within hours, he had walked the wing, twice taken statements from all-night staff, and begun pulling personnel records. What struck him first was the absence of anything personal in the wing itself. No coffee mugs, no snacks, no stray papers. It looked less like a space abandoned during an emergency and more like a scene deliberately scrubbed clean of context. When he visited the nurses' families, the picture only deepened. Helen's sister in Ohio was adamant that Helen would never leave her post without reason, especially not with her retirement just 7 months away. Dana's brother revealed something that surprised Klein. She had sent him a sealed envelope 5 years earlier with instructions only to open it if she ever vanished. Ivy's mother in San Francisco could barely speak through tears as she described her daughter's dream of working in underserved communities, and how thrilled she had been to be hired at Briarcliff, even if the place seemed remote and strange. The official missing persons report was filed by the end of the week. Flyers were distributed. Local news aired brief segments before moving on to bigger headlines. The media attention faded, as it always did. The hospital returned to routine. A memorial plaque was placed in the staff corridor and shifts were reassigned. But within the walls of the East Wing, something remained unsettled. Staff reported unease. Some refused to take night assignments in the isolation rooms. Patients spoke of shadows in the hallway and voices late at night. Most of it was dismissed as paranoia or suggestion. But for Detective Klein, the case never truly closed. He kept the file on a shelf above his desk for years, marked in red ink with a single word, unresolved. And as the decades passed and new buildings rose and old ones fell, that quiet wing in Tennessee waited, holding the secret of what happened that night in 1989, when 3 women stepped into darkness and were never seen again. The East Wing had remained locked for over a year following the nurse's disappearance, not by official decree but by silent consensus. Staff rotated around it, avoided discussions about it, and new hires were only given access when absolutely necessary. In time, the wing's doors were quietly reopened, its rooms reassigned to low-risk patients, and its memory diluted into hospital folklore. Most of the patients admitted there in the early 90s never knew what had happened beyond those walls just months earlier, and the few who asked were given vague replies about construction delays and staffing issues. Yet there was one exception. In the spring of 1991, a young patient named Evan Rowe, committed for bipolar disorder after a series of public disturbances, was housed in room 215-1 of the 5 original rooms from the incident. Evan was known for his restlessness and his tendency to tamper with the fixtures in his room. He unscrewed doorknobs, disassembled fans, and sometimes rearranged the ceiling panels when no one was watching. It was during one of these compulsive episodes that Evan found the journal page tucked deep inside the vent above his bed, folded 4 times and sealed with yellowing tape. The nurse on duty that evening, Carla Jennings, was new to Briarcliff and unaware of the wing's history. When Evan handed her the page with wide eyes and trembling fingers, she assumed it was just another scribbled note from a manic patient. But as she read it beneath the hallway light, her expression shifted. The handwriting was clean and cursive, the ink slightly faded but clearly preserved. At the top of the page was a name signed in small but firm script, Ivy Chan. The entry was dated October 1st, 2 days before her disappearance. It began with routine observations of patients and medication notes, but halfway down the page the tone changed. Ivy described an unnamed administrator requesting that she report to the records room after her shift, something that had not been on her schedule. She wrote that she had seen a young girl being led through the east hallway earlier that week, though there were no minors admitted to Briarcliff at the time. Most unsettling was a brief sentence at the bottom of the page written in smaller print, as if squeezed into the margin. She wrote that the girl was barefoot and had bruises along her forearms, and that she was certain no patient file had been created for her arrival. Carla brought the page to the shift supervisor, who promptly contacted the administrative lead. By morning, the page had been collected and placed into storage labeled as circumstantial and unrelated to the case. It was never shown to Detective Klein, who only learned of its existence 3 years later through an anonymous letter postmarked from Nashville. When Klein confronted the hospital director about the page, he was met with denial and polite confusion. No one could locate the original document, and no one could explain why the nurse who had discovered it had resigned only weeks after the incident, citing personal health issues. Undeterred, Klein filed a formal request to access the maintenance records for room 215 and adjacent units. In reviewing the logs, he found something peculiar. Between October and December of 1989, 3 maintenance calls had been scheduled for the east wing ceiling vents, all marked as completed by a technician named Robert Lasky. Klein attempted to track Lasky down but learned that he had died in a car accident in early '91. His reports were vague, referencing routine duct cleaning and minor repairs. Nothing was logged about removing or inspecting the fan in room 215. Klein began to suspect that Ivy's note had not been misplaced, but deliberately removed from the facility's records. He also found it unusual that the paper had not yellowed or cracked, despite being stored in a vent for over a year, suggesting that it had been placed there more recently, perhaps as a warning or a message for anyone who might be willing to look further. As he continued digging, he began reviewing the list of staff present during the days surrounding the disappearance. He noted one specific overlap: all 3 nurses had interacted with a temporary intake officer named Peter Millard, brought in from another psychiatric facility to assist with transitioning new patients to the East Wing. Millard had only worked at Briarcliff for 6 weeks, departing just days after the 3 nurses vanished. No formal exit interview was recorded, and when Klein contacted his last known employer, he discovered that Millard had not returned to psychiatric work afterward. In fact, he had moved out of state, entirely purchasing property in New Mexico under a different surname within the year. Armed with this information, Klein attempted to reopen the case officially, but by 1993, departmental budgets had been cut, and new leadership viewed the incident as a closed matter. Despite this, Klein continued independently. He began requesting access to archived patient lists, specifically focusing on the 2 weeks leading up to the nurse's disappearance. He discovered a discrepancy between internal logbooks and submitted reports to the State Health Board. On October 1st, an additional patient entry had been handwritten in a margin, then crossed out. No name was attached, only an age and condition: female, estimated 13, catatonic, unresponsive. The room number listed was 213, directly across from Ivy's assigned night check zone. Klein made copies of everything and filed them in his personal folder, which had now grown from a single case file into a locked drawer containing over 200 pages. Meanwhile, the story of the journal page quietly disappeared from hospital memory, only mentioned in whispers among a few longtime staff members who remembered Ivy fondly. Some believed she had planted it as a desperate clue, others felt it had been placed there by someone else to mislead investigators. In the years that followed, room 215 remained occupied on and off, with no other unusual discoveries, yet the legend of the fan vent lingered. New nurses were told half-jokingly to check the ducts if anything felt off. Patients occasionally scribbled poems on their walls referencing voices behind vents and hands reaching through the ceiling. Most of it was dismissed as delusions. But for Detective Klein, every detail mattered. The handwriting on the page had matched samples from Ivy's employment forms. The timeline aligned with the sudden increase in undocumented patient transfers. And the mention of the barefoot girl seemed more than a coincidence. The page may have been the only surviving artifact of the final days before the shift that changed everything. By early 1994, the disappearance of the 3 nurses from Briarcliff Hills Sanatorium had faded from public conversation, but not from the mind of Detective Emery Klein. His obsession with the case had grown slowly fueled not by drama, but by details that refused to sit quietly in the drawer. The missing journal page, the crossed-out patient record, and the vanished intake officer formed a jagged puzzle that kept shifting just when he thought he had found its edges. He returned to the facility under the pretense of consulting on security protocol updates. With years of personnel turnover, most staff no longer recognized him, and the director had changed twice since the original investigation. Using his access, Klein requested archival footage for the week of the nurse's disappearance, hoping to find patterns or overlooked moments. The tapes had been stored on magnetic reels in a locked cabinet behind the old security office, untouched for nearly 5 years. Dust coated the boxes, and several labels were missing or smeared, but one tape in particular caught his attention. It was dated October 3, 1989, and marked with a hand-drawn circle in red pen. Klein borrowed the playback equipment and brought it to a forensic lab across county lines for analysis. When the lab technicians began reviewing the footage, they noticed immediately that something was wrong. The timestamp rolled forward as expected, but the feed cut to black at precisely 10:17 p.m., remaining dark for exactly 17 minutes before returning. The return frame was steady, as if no disruption had occurred. Yet, in those missing minutes, according to every report, the nurses would have still been on duty. No signs of tampering appeared on the tape housing, and the power logs for the building showed no outages during that window. Klein leaned in as the technician scrubbed frame by frame before and after the blackout. Right before the screen went dark, the corridor camera captured Ivy passing room 213 holding a clipboard. Dana appeared moments later, following with a tray cart used for administering medication. Helen stood near the far end of the hallway, speaking to someone just out of frame. It was unclear who she was addressing, but her posture was not casual. Her arms were crossed, her chin lifted slightly, and her body did not move for nearly 20 seconds. Then the screen turned black. The technician enhanced the audio track while isolating background noise, hoping to pick up stray sounds captured by the low-grade mic embedded in the camera unit. For the first 10 minutes of the recording, the expected hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional footstep echoed softly. But at 10:16 p.m. a new sound emerged. It was faint, muffled by distance and quality, but distinctly a voice. Female. The technician replayed it multiple times, adjusting the frequency until the words became decipherable. The voice said 3 simple words: "Do not scream." Then silence. After the blackout ended, the hallway remained empty. No carts, no movement. No trace of the 3 women who had just been there. The technician looked to Klein and said only that this was not a glitch. Something had been purposefully removed or concealed. The implications were immediate. Someone with knowledge of the building's surveillance system had either edited the feed or disabled the equipment in real time. Either possibility required access and precision. Klein submitted a formal request for the original building plans and wiring schematics of Briarcliff Hills, which he obtained from the county records office. He traced the location of the East Wing camera system, noting that the corridor feed passed through a central relay housed in the maintenance tunnel beneath the north wing. That tunnel, he learned, had been restricted since the early 80s due to structural concerns, but certain staff members still used it as a shortcut during emergencies. He interviewed 3 former maintenance workers from the period surrounding the nurse's disappearance. 2 recalled nothing unusual. The third, however, a man named Elliot Frey, mentioned something odd. He had discovered a loose panel along the tunnel wall in late October 1989 and reported it to his supervisor. Inside the panel had been a small switch box with unfamiliar wiring labeled with white adhesive tape that read "Manual Override." He was told to ignore it and focus on structural tasks. Frey's account gave Klein his next lead. If a manual override system existed, it had likely been installed to bypass or control camera feeds without tripping the system's broader power grid. Klein began cross-referencing staff logs to see who would have had knowledge of such an installation. One name surfaced repeatedly across various forms: Dr. Conrad Merrill. Though he was not an engineer, Dr. Merrill had long overseen infrastructure changes and had served as the facility's medical director during that time. He had retired quietly in 1992 and moved to a lakeside property near Chattanooga. Klein contacted him under the guise of conducting historical interviews for a book about state-run psychiatric institutions. When they met at a quiet diner, Dr. Merrill appeared composed and alert despite his age. He remembered Helen and Dana clearly and spoke fondly of Ivy's optimism. But when Klein gently shifted the topic toward the surveillance system, Dr. Merrill became guarded. He said maintenance was not his domain and any security issues would have been handled by facilities or external contractors. The conversation yielded little direct evidence, but Klein observed one moment that stayed with him. When he mentioned the specific 17-minute blackout, Merrill's left hand trembled slightly against his coffee cup. It was the first and only movement that broke his otherwise still demeanor. After the meeting, Klein drove back to his office and added a new document to the case file, outlining potential internal manipulation of security footage and naming Dr. Merrill as a person of interest. He also began searching for the original security manager from 1989, hoping someone might recall the system's design. In the following weeks, Klein submitted an official request to reclassify the Briarcliff case as an open investigation based on new forensic evidence, but bureaucracy moved slowly and internal priorities had shifted. Still, the audio recording from the tape provided Klein with something he had not possessed before. A voice. A phrase. "Do not scream." It implied fear control and the presence of someone giving orders. It also implied that the nurses may have been conscious, perhaps even compliant under duress during the moments leading to their disappearance. For the first time in years, the case had a sound. Not just static or silence, but a human voice breaking through. That voice would lead him to explore patient interviews from the surrounding months, hoping someone else had heard it too. The deeper Klein pressed into the layers surrounding the Briarcliff case, the more his investigation began to pull threads that stretched well beyond the night of October 3rd. The surveillance blackout and the recorded voice had given the case new momentum, but it also left Klein aware that something more orchestrated had been at work. Something that could not be explained by one technician error or the spontaneous decision of 3 experienced nurses. In his notes, Klein had returned again and again to the silence that followed the blackout. No alarms were triggered, no exit logs recorded, no witness accounts documented. But the strangest detail remained unaccounted for the unknown person Helen had appeared to speak to, captured partially in the final visible frame before the footage cut to black. It had not been a patient, at least not one registered. Nor had it been a nurse. Klein could not see the face, only a figure in white standing at the far end of the hallway just beyond the motion sensor range. The figure was still facing Helen, unmoving. From that position, no staff member should have been present without badge clearance. And yet, someone had been there. In seeking clarification, Klein began reviewing staff visitor logs from the week of the disappearance. Briarcliff kept a physical logbook at the front desk in 1989, signed manually by any visitors not directly employed at the facility. While many entries were routine family visits, repairman vendor deliveries, one caught his attention. On October 2nd, the day before the nurses vanished, a visitor signed in under the name Father Joseph Keene. He listed his reason as spiritual counsel and was scheduled to meet with a patient in the West Wing. The record showed that he entered at 3:22 p.m. and signed out 2 hours later. Klein found this peculiar. Briarcliff had no on-site chapel and had rarely allowed external religious visitors without prior arrangement. Yet there was no corresponding appointment scheduled, no patient record linking the name Keene to a clergy visit, and no official documentation authorizing the entry. The page had been signed hastily, and the handwriting appeared forced. A call to the diocese revealed no registered clergy under that name. In fact, they had never heard of a Father Keene affiliated with any Tennessee parish. The description offered by the receptionist on duty at the time was limited. She remembered a tall man, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in what looked like priest's clothing, though she could not verify if it was authentic or ceremonial. He wore glasses and carried a leather-bound folder. She noted that he had a polite manner, but did not linger or make conversation. What stood out most to her, she admitted, was his shoes. They were not what she expected a priest to wear. Dark, polished leather, yes, but the soles were heavy, almost like military boots. She had not thought about that day in years and seemed unsettled by the memory now. When asked if she had seen him leave, she paused. She said she remembered looking up and realizing he was no longer in the lobby. She had assumed he had left quietly, but no one had watched him walk out. Klein returned to the security logs for October 2nd. The exit door cameras, which should have captured every departing visitor, recorded no footage of a man matching Keen's description leaving the facility. This led Klein to question whether the individual had used another exit, possibly unauthorized. His focus shifted back to the maintenance tunnel beneath the north wing. If someone were familiar with the layout, especially someone who had been in the facility before he could have entered through the front and exited through the tunnel. This theory raised more questions. Why impersonate a priest? Why visit the day before the nurses vanished? And why return the following night, as suggested by the figure on the tape? The implication was clear. The man had come with a purpose, and the nurses had seen something they should not have. To verify whether this visitor had entered before, Klein expanded his timeline and pulled logbooks dating back 6 months prior. The name Father Joseph Keen did not appear again, but one similar signature appeared under the name John Keen, listed as a state auditor on an inspection run in July. That visit had also been brief, with no formal report filed afterward. Klein began to believe the name had been used as a cover more than once. He sent the visitor log pages to a handwriting analyst who confirmed that both signatures had likely been written by the same individual. This suggested premeditation. Someone had created an alias, used it more than once, and moved through Briarcliff unnoticed. At the same time, Klein began investigating patients who had been admitted or transferred during those 6 months. He focused on unaccompanied individuals with limited documentation. Among these, one name surfaced that had not appeared in his earlier reviews. A young woman listed only as Tilda J., age 16, had been admitted for severe depression in late September and transferred 2 weeks later to an unknown facility. Her intake form was sparse, containing only a first name, an approximate age, and a single-line diagnosis. No parent or guardian signature, no emergency contact. The attending physician was listed as Dr. C. Merrill. Her room assignment had been in the East Wing Room 213, directly across from the camera's final view. The realization struck hard. The nurses had disappeared on October 3rd. Tilda had arrived the week before and vanished without formal discharge. There had been no mention of her in any official reports. It now seemed likely that the girl Ivy had described in her journal page, the one barefoot with bruises, was not imagined or mistaken. She had been real, and her presence at Briarcliff had been hidden. If Helen, Donna, and Ivy had discovered her situation, and perhaps attempted to intervene, it might explain why they were silenced. Klein speculated that Tilda had either been removed or used as leverage. In either case, the person in white at the end of the corridor may have played a central role. If that person was the same man impersonating Father Keen, then the disappearance was no accident. It was a controlled removal with intent. Klein began digging into property records and employment databases under the names John Keen, Joseph Keen, and similar aliases. Though most searches turned up nothing useful, one image caught his attention. A security photo from an Arizona state hospital dated 1985 showed a visitor under the name Charles Kennan. The man bore a striking resemblance to the figure partially seen in the Briarcliff footage. Klein printed the image and added it to his growing folder. The man had changed names, states, and professions, but he had continued visiting psychiatric institutions across the South. Klein had no proof of criminal activity, but his gut told him that whoever this man was, he knew what had happened to those nurses. By late summer of 1995, Briarcliff Hills Sanatorium had begun landscaping renovations intended to expand the walking paths and remove overgrown trees along the east side of the grounds. The east wing, where the nurses had last been seen, faced a quiet grove that had been left mostly untouched for decades. Among the trees stood a large ash tree taller than the others, with a split trunk that curved slightly away from the building. The groundskeepers working under contract from the county were instructed to clear the brush around its base to prepare for a memorial garden. One morning, as two workers were digging near the exposed roots, the tip of a rusted metal corner caught the edge of a shovel. They assumed it was old piping or scrap from the building's original construction. But after clearing more dirt, they uncovered a rectangular metal box roughly the size of a shoebox sealed with wax and tightly wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting. The box had no visible label, no lock, and no identifying features beyond its weight and the rust that had eaten away at its hinges. The foreman contacted the hospital administrator, who in turn contacted county officials. By the time Klein was informed, the box had already been moved into a storage room near the main office. When he arrived the following morning, the air in the room felt heavier than usual. He sat with the administrator and requested permission to open the container under supervised conditions. With gloves and a camera rolling for documentation, Klein carefully unwrapped the plastic, peeled back the wax seal, and lifted the lid. Inside, there were several objects arranged with intention. At the top, wrapped in cloth, was a thin silver bracelet engraved with the name Ivy, dated 1987. Beneath it lay a folded envelope containing 3 photographs of adolescent girls, each marked with a number written in pencil at the bottom corner. One of the girls bore a resemblance to the patient, listed as Tilda J. Alongside the photos was a small journal filled with medical notes written in a hurried, uneven hand. The entries documented physical injuries, medication dosages, and room assignments not listed in any official records. Each journal page referenced patients by first names or initials. One name, Sari, appeared repeatedly and was associated with room 213. Descriptions included bruising patterns, irregular sedation, and notes of resistance during restraint. The entries were signed simply with the letter D, which Klein believed to be Dana Morales. The final entry, dated October 2nd, stated that she had witnessed a transfer at night involving 2 men and an unconscious girl with no file update logged afterward. The entry ended with a sentence that read, "They told Helen to stay quiet." Klein turned the bracelet over in his hand, noting the fine etching and the year marked 2 years before Ivy's employment at Briarcliff. He wondered whether she had brought it from home or received it while working. Either way, its presence in the box confirmed that the nurses had been aware of unregistered patients and had begun documenting their injuries. Further inside the box, tucked beneath the journal, was a folded sheet of thin paper containing a list of dates and codes. Klein recognized the format from internal shift scheduling sheets. These codes matched days when surveillance footage had been altered or disabled. Most notably, October 3rd was marked with a circle and a single word written beside it, "Final." The implication was undeniable. The nurses had anticipated that something would happen and had tried to preserve what they could. It also meant someone else had known about the contents of this box and had buried it intentionally. The fact that it was found beneath the ash tree directly facing the isolation wing suggested it had been hidden in haste or desperation. It had survived years of storms, soil pressure, and silence. Klein sent the contents to a private lab for analysis. The journal paper matched the type used in Briarcliff's medical records. The ink and handwriting were consistent with Dana's personnel forms. The photographs, though undated, appeared to be taken in the hallway near the basement storage room. One showed a girl sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest, and her wrists visibly marked. Another showed a clipboard held by a gloved hand with a nameplate partially visible. The third was blurry, but showed a hospital bed in a room with no windows and an IV pole beside it. None of the rooms in the east wing matched that layout, leading Klein to suspect a different part of the building, possibly underground. He requested access to historical blueprints focusing on sublevels and discontinued sections. Among the archived materials, he found references to an old storage wing built during the original construction in the 1940s. It had been sealed off during renovations in the 1970s but never officially decommissioned. A faded map showed a narrow corridor beneath the east wing with rooms labeled as Storage A through F. These rooms were not accessible through standard stairwells and required passage through a maintenance access hatch located near the boiler room. Klein arranged for a structural engineer to examine the hatch, which had been bolted shut for years. When it was finally opened, the scent of mold and rust filled the air. The corridor beyond was damp and unlit, lined with decaying boxes and collapsed shelving. But at the end of the hallway, behind a rusted metal door, was a small room with peeling blue walls and a single hospital bed frame still bolted to the floor. Klein stood in silence as his flashlight scanned the corners. A small stain marked the floor near the bed's side. He photographed every surface, every bolt, every wire. He saw no signs of recent use, but the dimensions and windowless design matched the room seen in the photograph from the box. Whatever had happened here, it had taken place in silence, away from any authorized medical supervision. He felt the walls holding secrets too old to speak freely, but heavy enough to remain behind. Before leaving, he found one final item tucked beneath the corner of a broken cabinet. It was a thin strip of torn cloth with the initials IC sewn into the edge. Ivy Chan. The fabric was brittle and damp, but the stitching remained legible. Klein placed it in a sealed evidence bag and made no remarks. The evidence recovered from the ash tree box had given Klein new direction, but it had also made the silence around Briarcliff feel more deliberate. There had been too many coincidences, too many gaps in records, and too many moments where answers should have been found, but were not. As he reviewed the handwritten notes in the journal, he noticed something beyond the documented injuries and shift codes. The writing bore patterns that felt familiar. Some entries transitioned from medical observations to deeply personal reflections. The tone shifted from clinical to confessional. She wrote not only about the patients, but about her own sense of fear, her frustration with the institution, and the weight of watching people disappear without anyone noticing. One line stood out to Klein. She wrote that sometimes you have to give up who you are if you want anyone to listen. That sentence sent him back to Dana Morales, the second of the 3 nurses who had vanished, the one whose personnel file had always felt the least complete. Klein requested Dana's employment verification records and traced her nursing license through the Tennessee Board. It had been issued in 1986 with prior licensure from Illinois. The dates aligned with her transfer to Briarcliff in 1987. However, the photo on the Illinois record did not match the one attached to her Briarcliff ID. The names were the same, and the birth date was within a few weeks, but the faces were clearly different women. This discovery sent a ripple through Klein's thoughts. He dug deeper, cross-referencing Dana's Social Security number and tax filings. What emerged was a trail of inconsistencies. No high school records under that name, no previous employment history before 1984, no family members listed on emergency contact forms. The paper trail began in Chicago just months before Dana had applied for her nursing license. Before that, she did not exist in any searchable database. Suspecting the use of an alias, Klein reached out to a contact in Chicago's Law Enforcement Records Division. After several days, the officer returned a file from 1982 involving a woman named Delia Martinez. She had worked as a reporter for a small, independent newspaper and had been investigating alleged abuse at a pediatric psychiatric hospital on the city's south side. The article she had been preparing was never published. The paper shut down the following year after its offices were damaged in a fire. Delia Martinez disappeared shortly after, and no missing person report was ever filed. The photograph attached to the file showed a woman who matched the Briarcliff ID photo of Dana Morales. Klein requested confirmation from a forensic specialist who matched bone structure markers between the 2 images with a confidence rating over 92%. If Dana Morales had once been Delia Martinez, then her presence at Briarcliff was not by accident. She had entered under a new name, acquired a nursing license, and positioned herself within the system she had once tried to expose from the outside. Klein began to read her journal entries again with this revelation in mind. Certain phrases took on new meaning. She wrote of people forgetting what mattered once they wore the badge. She referred to silence as a second paycheck and said that the only way to fight back was to stay close and wait for the moment to document everything. Her notes on the patients were not just medical, they were testimony. She was building a case from the inside using her new identity to gather what she could never obtain as a journalist. Klein felt the weight of her effort. She had not just vanished. She had infiltrated a system hoping to reveal its rot, only to become part of the very cover-up she had feared. The next step was to find out how she had entered Briarcliff under a new identity without triggering background flags. Klein returned to the hiring records and found that Dana had been recruited through a temporary staffing agency based in Nashville. He contacted the agency, which had since changed ownership, and asked for archived employment data. The files were incomplete, but one document showed that her reference had been approved by a doctor named C. Merrill. Dr. Conrad Merrill again. His name continued to appear at every critical junction. Klein reviewed Dana's shift history and found that she had been assigned to the East Wing exclusively during her final months. She had access to rooms where undocumented patients were housed, and she had night shift rotation aligned with both Ivy and Helen. It was likely that the three women had begun to work together after discovering that the girls being brought in were not properly admitted or recorded. The journal hinted at shared conversations, moments of doubt, and quiet collaboration. Dana had written that Helen saw the truth in the files, and that Ivy kept looking where she had been told not to. Klein believed that the journal had been written during the final weeks before the nurses vanished. In one of the last entries, Dana mentioned a meeting scheduled with someone from the outside. She referred to the person only as R, and wrote that he had agreed to receive the documents if she could get them to the parking lot by Friday. She said Helen had offered to distract the administrator if needed, and Ivy had agreed to deliver the package. Klein checked the calendar for October 1989. The first Friday of the month was October 6th, 3 days after the women were last seen. The entry meant they had been preparing to act. They had gathered evidence, made a plan, and attempted to leak the truth. The package had likely never reached its destination. Or, if it had, no one had come forward to say so. In a final effort to locate the mysterious R. Klein, reviewed Briarcliff's visitor logs and parking surveillance for the week in question. Though the camera system was limited, one tape captured a car parked outside the facility on the evening of October 3rd. It was a dark-colored sedan with Illinois plates. The driver remained in the vehicle for over 40 minutes, then left. No one was recorded entering or exiting the facility during that window. The license plate number was partially visible. Klein sent the information to the DMV and discovered the vehicle had been registered to a man named Raymond Ortiz, a former editor of the same newspaper where Delia Martinez had once worked. Ortiz had moved to Texas in the early 90s and passed away in 2007. If Dana had arranged to pass the files to him, and if he had waited in that car while no one appeared, then he, too, had likely suspected something had gone wrong. The sublevel beneath Briarcliff Hills had not appeared in any modern blueprints yet. Klein had confirmed its existence after finding the hospital bed bolted to the concrete floor in a sealed chamber with no registered purpose. The evidence from the ashtray box and Dana's journal had all pointed towards that space being used to house unrecorded patients. Now, armed with confirmation that Donna had been operating under a false identity to expose those practices, Klein turned his attention to an area long rumored but never officially acknowledged by current staff. It was referred to in passing by former employees as the locked wing. Not the East Wing, where the nurses were last seen, but another segment of the hospital built during the original phase in the 1940s and sealed off during renovations in the 1970s. Multiple times throughout the investigation, Klein had heard mention of it in vague terms. Now, with momentum building, he needed to find it and understand its role in the timeline leading up to the disappearances. Klein contacted the county archive to retrieve blueprints from the hospital's initial construction. The oldest document in storage was dated 1947 and had been digitized for preservation. It included a segment labeled Ward C with a corridor branching off from the main basement level. This corridor contained 6 rooms, a medical preparation area, and what appeared to be a records closet. In the updated maps from 1979, Ward C was absent. The corridor had been removed from the plans entirely. That erasure suggested intentional concealment. Klein drove to Briarcliff early the next morning with printed blueprints and requested access to the basement levels. The current administrator, though nervous, allowed it under supervision. Klein spent nearly 3 hours walking every inch of the basement hallway, comparing angles and distances with the blueprint in hand. He found a mismatched wall near the old furnace chamber. The texture of the cinder blocks changed halfway through the stretch, and one area rang hollow when tapped. The discovery of a hollow wall was enough to warrant further action. Klein returned later that week with a forensics team under a temporary warrant and authorization from County Legal Counsel. Using portable tools, they removed a section of the false wall. Behind it was a sealed metal door with no markings. It had no visible lock, only a recessed handle and signs of aging where paint had chipped and rust had bloomed. The door creaked open with effort, revealing a dark hallway coated in dust and cobwebs. The air smelled of old mold and disinfectant, a mixture that had clung to the room for decades. Klein stepped inside, flashlight raised, his team following close behind. The corridor matched the 1947 blueprint exactly. Room numbers C1 through C6 were still visible on small brass plates above each door. Every room had a reinforced viewing window with cracked plastic or shattered glass. Inside each room was a single bed frame, a drain in the floor, and empty shelves affixed to the wall. In the farthest room, C6 Klein found something different. The bed was still intact and the sheets had not been removed. Though faded and covered in dust, the fabric bore a recognizable pattern. It matched the linen seen in one of the photos recovered from the ashtray box. On the floor next to the bed was a broken clip from a staff badge, though the name insert was missing. Near the back wall sat a small metal stool. On it rested a tray containing 2 empty medication vials and a rubber tourniquet. Forensic analysis later confirmed the vials contained trace amounts of diazepam, a sedative commonly used in psychiatric treatments. The labels had been scratched off. Klein took photos of every detail. He knew the room had been used long after it was supposed to have been decommissioned. There was evidence of occupation into the late 1980s, long after its official closure. The lighting fixtures had been rewired with modern tubes. A small radio had been plugged into an outlet hidden behind a loose panel, suggesting staff had spent extended time in the space. Moving toward the records closet, Klein found the door wedged shut. With careful force, it opened to reveal dozens of disorganized folders, water-stained and brittle. Most were blank, but a few retained their labeling. One was marked ~J, and another bore the initials SM. Both folders contained photos and hand-drawn body diagrams documenting injuries. The dates ranged from 1985 to 1989. At the back of the closet, taped to the inside wall, was a laminated schedule with the heading Room C5 Medication Log. It listed daily times and dosages, all written in the same handwriting. At the bottom was a note, no access without code. The name signed at the bottom was C. Merrill. It was the most direct link Klein had yet found between the former medical director and the hidden facility. He photocopied everything and removed only the materials necessary to avoid damaging the fragile contents. As they prepared to exit, one forensic technician called Klein over to the entry wall. There, behind a curtain of dust, was a faded message scrawled in marker. It read, "We saw everything. They made us disappear." Beneath the writing were 3 initials carved faintly into the paint, HBDMIC. Klein ran his fingers gently over the carvings. Helen Brooks, Dana Morales, Ivy Chan. The message was not just a warning, it was a signature. A final trace left by 3 women who had known their time was limited. For the first time since the investigation began, Klein felt as though he had stepped directly into the moment they had lived and died. He made sure the wall was photographed and sealed. The team documented every room, every object, and left the space with new gravity. No longer was the case theoretical. It was built into the walls of the hospital itself. Klein left the locked wing carrying the weight of something that now felt irreversible. The evidence recovered from Ward C had shifted the entire investigation from speculation to reality. The etched initials, the sealed rooms, and the medication logs proved that the nurses had not only discovered something dangerous, but had likely paid the cost for trying to expose it. Still, there remained a question that kept pressing itself deeper into Klein's thoughts. If the nurses had uncovered what was happening, and if they had tried to alert someone on the outside who had protected the people responsible from exposure for so long, that question led him back to the documentation trail. Names could be changed, memories could be erased, but paper left shadows even when carefully hidden. Klein returned to the county archive this time requesting internal correspondence between Briarcliff and the State Health Board during the years 1985 to 1990. After several days of waiting, he received a packet of administrative memos and interdepartmental letters. Most were routine addressing staffing levels and equipment needs. One folder, however, had a red sticker on its tab and was marked as restricted. Inside it, Klein found references to something labeled Code D. The term Code D did not appear in any medical manuals or state procedure documentation. It was not listed among the hospital's emergency codes or treatment protocols. The first memo using the phrase came from 1986 and had been addressed from Dr. Merrill to a senior official at the Department of Mental Health. In it, he requested approval to initiate a Code D transfer protocol for non-compliant minors exhibiting high resistance to traditional therapy. He described the patients as emotionally volatile and better suited for low-visibility programs. The reply came 2 weeks later, handwritten on hospital letterhead, granting conditional approval for temporary housing under discretionary supervision. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the initials next to it matched those of a regional supervisor who had since retired. Klein read the exchange twice. It became clear that Code D had been used as an internal classification to move unrecorded patients into isolation without triggering oversight reviews. No audits had been scheduled during that window. No follow-ups were conducted. Further pages in the folder included photocopies of shift rosters that showed Donna's name aligned with several Code D nights. She had been assigned to monitor patients listed only by initials. In the margin of one roster, someone had written "Keep door to C5 closed after midnight." Another note instructed staff not to log visitor access during Code D sessions. Klein searched for more details and found a list of names written in ink on the back of a maintenance request. There were 9 names, most of them female, aged between 10 and 16. Next to each name was a box. 7 had been checked. 2 remained blank. The document was not dated, but the ink was consistent with the other pages. At the bottom of the sheet was a sentence scribbled in pencil. No photos unless requested by Central. The implication of these documents hit Klein with familiar unease. These children had not just been admitted quietly, they had been processed under an informal system moved between facilities and kept off formal records. He contacted the state records office and asked for birth certificates or social service placements for the names on the list. Of the 7 checked names, 5 had no birth records in Tennessee. 2 had expired Medicaid claims but no addresses. None of them appeared in the National Missing Children database. The 2 unchecked names could not be traced. Klein feared they may have never even been entered into the system. One name on the list was Tilda J. The box beside her name had been checked. Her file had been in the records closet in Ward C. Klein knew now that she had not been transferred or released. She had been processed. That word sat in his throat like gravel. He needed more than documents. He needed someone who could speak to what Code D had looked like from inside. He began interviewing former staff, focusing on those who had left the hospital before the 1990s. Most were reluctant to speak or claimed to remember nothing of significance. Eventually, he found one retired nurse, a woman named Beverly Trask, who had worked on the night shift from 1983 to 1988. She had moved to a small town in Kentucky and lived in a quiet cottage with her son. Klein met her on her porch with coffee and a printed list of patient names. She scanned the list, her hand trembling slightly as she reached the third name. She said she remembered the girl with that name said she had once brought her warm socks when they ran out of linens. The girl had bruises on her wrists and avoided eye contact. She had been housed downstairs in the part of the hospital no one liked to talk about. Beverly said there had been rules about what they could record. Staff were told to submit handwritten logs that were collected at the end of each shift and never entered into the central system. Beverly described how Code D shifts were always scheduled in pairs, with at least one staff member assigned who did not speak much. She said new nurses were kept away from the lower rooms. Once, she asked Dr. Merrill why they had no files for certain children, and he told her that the department preferred it that way. Beverly said she never questioned it again. Klein asked if she remembered Dana Ivy or Helen. She did. She said Helen was sharp and quiet, and that Ivy once stayed late after shift to sing to one of the girls who would not sleep. Beverly paused for a long moment before saying she had overheard Dana speaking with someone in the break room a few days before she disappeared. The woman had said if they did not act soon, no one would ever believe what they found. Beverly said she had not told anyone at the time because she was afraid. Klein thanked her, left a card, and returned to the station, feeling that the system he was chasing was not only hidden, but also deeply protected by silence and fear. As the fall rain drifted softly against his office window, Klein laid out the materials gathered from Ward C and the Code D files across the table in careful sequence. The evidence had grown into something that no longer resembled a single disappearance, but instead a pattern stretching across years and involving layers of bureaucracy that chose silence over accountability. He stared longest at the laminated medication log signed by Dr. Merrill and the carved initials left by the 3 missing nurses. Klein believed the journal, the bracelet, and the sealed rooms told one side of the truth. But he had not yet accounted for the presence of the unknown man who had appeared in the surveillance footage and the visitor log as Father Joseph Keene. That man had not only entered Briarcliff under false identities, but had done so without being flagged by any internal controls. If the nurses had been silenced, Klein believed this man had been one of the enforcers. He needed to put a name to the face before the final report could be written. Klein returned to the photo found in the Arizona hospital log where a visitor named Charles Kennan had entered under the guise of a social worker in 1985. The face in the photo bore a striking resemblance to the figure seen speaking with Helen Brooks before the footage cut to black. Klein had sent the image to a retired FBI analyst who specialized in historical case comparison. After a week of waiting, the analyst returned with a lead. She had located an older image in a federal employment database under the name Carlton McKay, a former security contractor who had worked with a series of mental health facilities across 4 southern states in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He had left government employment under sealed circumstances. The file noted that McKay had been reassigned after a whistleblower complaint, but did not detail the nature of the accusation. The analyst suggested that McKay may have adopted multiple aliases over the years, including Kennan and Keene. Using this information, Klein traced McKay's last known address to a rural property in Mississippi. The land had been sold in 1992, and no forwarding address was listed. However, tax filings under the name Carlton McKay continued through 1996, indicating that he had maintained legal activity even after moving off the grid. Klein contacted a local investigator who confirmed that McKay had used shell companies to perform private security work for psychiatric and juvenile facilities under contract. These shell firms avoided regulation and never appeared in state vendor databases. The earliest record placed McKay at a now-defunct institution in Louisiana that had been cited for negligence during the early 1980s. The pattern became clear. McKay had moved from one institution to another each time under a different name, performing tasks that involved patient restraint off record transfers and nighttime shifts requiring no official documentation. It was not difficult to imagine what his role had been at Briarcliff. Still, Klein needed to link McKay directly to the night of October 3rd. The name in the visitor log, Father Joseph Keene, had no surviving legal identity, but Klein had requested fingerprint enhancement from the box recovered beneath the ash tree. On the inner rim of the lid, a faint print had been lifted and sent for analysis. It returned with a partial match to a print recovered from a Louisiana child welfare investigation in 1982, one that had been sealed after the facility closed. The name listed in that case was Charles Kennan. The analyst confirmed that Charles Kennan and Carlton McKay were likely the same individual. Klein now had a partial fingerprint match visual confirmation and a pattern of behavior that tied McKay to unauthorized psychiatric activities in at least 5 institutions. The connection to Briarcliff was no longer speculative. He had been there. He had operated under a false identity. He had likely enforced the same invisible protocols the nurses had tried to expose. Klein turned back to Dana's journal and reread the final page. She had written that someone was coming to collect what we saw. She noted that he wore white and did not blink when he walked past the rooms. She said he had keys no one else had, and that Helen watched him open a door that no one had access to. Ivy had written separately in her recovered note that someone had taken Tilda at night without speaking, that someone had a face like it had been worn too long. The phrasing disturbed Klein, but it aligned with the theory that McKay had been present that night, perhaps orchestrating the removal of the girl and suppressing any resistance from the nurses. If the message carved in the hidden wing was their final act of defiance, then their silence had not been voluntary. It had been enforced by someone who had done the same in other places, someone who counted on the system's indifference. The last open question was why no one had reported the 3 nurses missing in a way that escalated beyond a single department memo. Their personnel files had been quietly marked inactive. Their lockers had been cleared by hospital security within a week. No official missing persons reports had been filed by the hospital administration. Klein requested communication logs from the staff director during that period and found that Dr. Merrill had sent internal notices stating that the 3 had resigned due to personal matters. No explanation was required. No family inquiries had been documented, possibly because at least 2 of the nurses had minimal family contacts listed. Dana's file under her false identity showed no next of kin. Ivy's emergency contact was a distant cousin who had moved out of state. Helen's parents had passed away years before. They had vanished in a place designed to erase silence with bureaucracy and reduce names to file codes. One final piece arrived unexpectedly. A brown envelope was delivered to Klein's desk without a return address. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license for a woman named Sarah Kwan, issued in 1991 in Kansas. The photo looked identical to Ivy Chan. The signature matched personnel records. Attached to the license was a handwritten note that said she lived. She went quiet. She is afraid. Klein could not confirm the sender. He ran the ID through the system and found no criminal record, no arrest warrants, and no missing persons report. He did find that the license had expired in 2000 and had not been renewed. There was no current address. He called in a federal contact to trace the license history, and they confirmed that a woman matching Ivy's description had applied for a driver's license using a temporary residential shelter as her address. That shelter had closed in 1993. The ceremony was small by design and even smaller in attendance. The new administrator at Briarcliff Hills Sanatorium stood near the edge of the East Grove with her hands folded and her eyes locked on the plaque set in the ground beneath the ash tree. She had taken over just 3 months earlier after the previous director resigned without public explanation. No statement had been issued. No press conference had been held. The hospital had decided quietly that it would let the past settle without headlines or defense. But a gesture was required, and so they agreed to a memorial garden. It had no budget and no announcement. Just a circle of stones and a single brass plate pressed into the soil. It read, "For those who were not believed, for those who were not buried, for those who remain unnamed." The wind shifted through the trees and stirred the petals of the wildflowers that had been planted around the trees' roots. They were the only colors that had not been chosen by the hospital. The local groundskeeper had decided on them himself and never asked permission. Klein stood at a distance watching the few faces who had come to stand in silence. Beverly Trask was among them, her hand clutching a folded handkerchief, though her face remained dry. Two former nurses from the 1980s stood beside her, their expressions unreadable. A representative from the state health department had been sent, but declined to speak. The only sound was the wind and the occasional creak of the nearby branches. Klein carried with him the files no one else wanted to hold. He had assembled them himself, 3 binders labeled Ivy Helen Dana. He had written his findings in long form documenting the Code D program, the forged employment histories, the erased surveillance footage, and the children who had passed through unregistered doors. He submitted his report to the state with a quiet confidence that no one would read it in full, but he included it anyway, not for policy, not for review, but because it mattered that someone had written it down. After the ceremony, Klein walked back toward the main building. His eyes followed the path where the sun filtered through the leaves and fell across the cracked walkway leading to the old East Wing. It had been closed to patients months earlier after structural deficiencies were discovered. No repairs had been ordered. The administration had plans to convert the space into storage. Klein knew it would be the last time he walked those halls. He entered through a side door with his badge one last time, moving through the quiet corridor with a practiced step. Room 213 remained locked. He paused in front of it for a moment before continuing. When he reached the nurse's station, he placed a copy of his report on the counter and added a photograph to the top of the stack. It was the only known picture of the 3 nurses together, taken during a hospital picnic in 1988. They were smiling, but the expressions held weight. They had known even then. Maybe not the scale, not the names, but the truth had begun to shape itself around them. Klein exited the building and returned to his car. He sat for a long time watching the fading outline of the ash tree from the parking lot. In his lap he held the envelope that had been mailed anonymously weeks earlier. Inside it, along with the copy of Ivy's old license, was a second note more recent and written in a rushed, careful hand. It said, "I wanted to tell someone, but I was afraid of what they would do to me again. I did not disappear, I hid. I do not want my name back. I want them to stop doing what they did." The note had no signature, no return address, no fingerprint trace. But it was her. Klein had compared the handwriting with Ivy's staff evaluations and patient logs. The strokes, the shape of the letters, the pressure, it was her. She had lived. She had survived whatever had happened on that October night, and chosen not to speak. Klein did not blame her. He understood that sometimes surviving required silence more than justice. Sometimes justice arrived only when the world changed enough to see what it had ignored. In the weeks following the dedication, the Department of Mental Health issued a brief statement acknowledging historical procedural errors and announcing an internal review of facility oversight during the 1980s. No names were mentioned. No apologies were issued, but the investigation triggered new audits across the state, and several dormant cases were reopened. A list of outdated facilities was circulated among advocacy groups, and for the first time in decades, the state allowed external review panels to inspect sealed archives. Klein received quiet thanks from a handful of young interns who said the report had given them reason to keep asking questions. He never sought recognition. He declined all interviews and turned down requests to appear in documentaries. He believed that the story belonged to the women who had written it with their choices, their fear, their courage, and their disappearance. His role was only to carry the final pages where they could be seen. 1 month after the garden dedication, Klein received a package delivered without a sender. Inside was a thin book wrapped in brown paper. The title was etched into the cover by hand. It read, "Journal of Room C." Inside were reprints of Dana's entries, Ivy's notes, and Helen's medication logs, all transcribed and formatted without commentary. At the back was a final page printed on delicate parchment. It was written in a voice that was calm, certain, and direct. It said, "We were never lost. We were erased. But stories can be rewritten if someone chooses to remember. Let this be that memory. Let it stand where we could not." Klein placed the book on the shelf of his study beside a small collection of unmarked binders. He lit a candle beside it and left the room quiet. That night, he slept without dreams for the first time in years. The story of the missing nurses did not end in courtrooms or press conferences. It ended with 3 women who chose to document the truth when silence would have been safer. It ended with a garden planted over secrets. It ended with a single survivor who carried the pain not as proof of weakness, but as a quiet declaration that survival itself was a form of justice. And it ended with a man who listened when others dismissed and who believed when others denied. Stories like these do not always end with names in history books, but they do end, and how they end depends on who is left to carry the memory. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more true-to-life narratives. Let us know in the comments what you thought about the plot and where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.